Hi, my name is Sarah Dirks, and this is Module 4, Special Education Interviews. These are the three people I interviewed. Ken Freeman is our paraprofessional. I chose him because I've had him in class a couple times, and he's phenomenal. One of the best paras I've ever worked with, and he currently works with a student who's visually impaired, but he also works with some other students with learning disabilities. Lauren Richter, she's an occupational therapist by trade, but she also works in our LIFT classroom, which is students who have exceptional disabilities, and then Dr. Gerke is the administrator. The child find procedures. I mainly talked to Dr. Gerke and Lauren about this because Ken, though he has experience in Missouri, he doesn't work with the identification procedure, and then on top of that, by the time they come to high school, this isn't something that he would be involved in, more so of just he's assigned a student to work with. But both Lauren and Dr. Gerke said that students have to be recommended by their parents. The parents have to request this. And then in the high school level, the process is that goes to our school psychologist, who then starts gathering information. They might be put into our intervention process where they'll start collecting data from their classroom teacher, and then they'll go through a formal evaluation process. Lauren, who, because she is an occupational therapist, has done evaluations with our younger population, but by the time, again, like I said, they get to the high school, most of our students have been identified that she works with. The first question I asked every one of them is, what are the challenges? For Ken, his was the steep learning curve. So when he was hired, he was assigned to Liam, who is our student who is visually impaired. He has macular degeneration, and so he's slowly going blind. And so Ken's role was to read, to help him with Braille. Liam is also a student who's from China, and so he's also learning English. And there was just a lot of challenges. And so initially that was a huge learning curve for him. The other thing that he's dealt with is just what are his roles as a motivator. He's assigned students, and some students just don't care, and they're disruptive and rude, and his job isn't, because he was a teacher for so long, he struggles with being a teacher versus being a para. And then, is he supposed to be motivating these students, or is he just supposed to be providing a service to them? I put that quote on there. He said he has two jobs as a paraprofessional, to be happy and help people, and he is the best. And so I'm very lucky to get to work with him. For Lauren, a lot had to do with just the time constraints, dealing with filling out paperwork for all of our IEPs. You know, it's what, a 11 to 17 page document, depending on the needs of the student, and then making sure that's up to date every year, and then putting together meetings for those IEPs. And then she still has her occupational therapy workload, and so beyond having her own caseload with students, she still works with some students in that regards. And her biggest challenge was that it does take away with that one-on-one time, or she'll have to take it home and work on that at home. And then Dr. Gerke kind of mentioned the same thing. That week alone, I interviewed him on Friday, and he said that he had been to 10 IEP meetings that week alone, and that's 10 hours in meetings. And then the second thing is he kept on talking about managing the process. I think in the previous lesson, he talked about knowing the law, and I think he's very up to date on that, and I think he feels in his role he has to manage the process. So he wants to be able to devote more time to be supportive of teachers versus just managing. For Ken, the rewards, the steep learning curve with Liam was a challenge, but the reward is also being able to work with Liam. I've had Liam in class, and he's a phenomenal student. He's so fun to work with. And so another reason I chose Ken is that he doesn't work with what we would normally think of as SPED in that respect. But Liam definitely has a need that an IEP has to meet. And then in addition, Ken just talked about, like, sometimes he'll be in a math classroom, and if teachers want his help, he'll be working with a group of students that are on his caseload, but then some other students will get involved and ask for help, and then they'll build relationships with him. For Lauren, it's just watching her students achieve. Again, since she's working with our exceptional population, just seeing them grow. She talked about one student who graduated last year, and from freshman year, he was so reserved and wouldn't talk to anyone. And by senior year, he was walking around and giving high fives, and he knew people's names, and he was just a fun student to be around. And so she was really excited to see him grow in socially, but by senior year, he was also working at Hy-Vee a couple hours a day. And so being able to be out in the general population and I think being integrated into the community, not just at the school, but the community at large, to make sure that the student knows that he can be successful outside of Northwest. And then Kevin was the same way. He really appreciates working with our students with exceptional disabilities. He says that he could have a really bad morning, and during lunchtime, he'll go and hang out with this group of students, and it'll make his day. He also appreciates the efforts that our staff will put in with the student population. So supervision of those working in the field. Obviously, Ken does not work directly, like he doesn't supervise at all. But one of the things he did talk about is the fact that sometimes administration somewhat doesn't know who their paraprofessionals are. Very rarely does he work with anyone at that level other than in the hiring process. He's hired by an administrator, and unless they get in trouble, they don't generally make it to the office, or maybe an administrator doesn't know who they are. He says that sometimes the head of the SPED department, who is not really an administrator, but she works directly with them, will take a more active role, but unless the para is being evaluated or in trouble, they don't interact too much. For Lauren, her big deal was just being able to build relationships and making sure that teachers take time for self-care. It's an emotionally exhausting job working with students in general, and then you take on the high needs population, but also understand what you're getting into when you're taking on a role of supervisor. And Kevin's big deal, which is interesting considering our assignment last week, was to educate yourself. Make sure you understand your responsibility as an administrator, specifically in the areas of special education. And then he also mentioned I think sometimes the schools will focus more on our general education population, and the SPED population gets forgotten or get pushed to the side. And so make sure you do some focus on that. Working with parents. In Blue Valley, I didn't know this, but paraprofessionals are specifically said not to interact with parents, which kind of makes sense. Their names aren't on our IEPs. They don't want to be held legally responsible other than the job task at hand and making sure that the hours that the student needs help with are being met. But specifically with Liam's parents, he does interact with Liam's mom on a pretty regular basis because he works with Liam so many times in a day, and he can kind of show and tell Liam's mom how he's doing in every class and what needs to be done that's different. And I think that because of that relationship, Liam's been able to grow, and he's become more independent this year than he was 2 years ago. Lauren's big deal is making sure that parents understand that she gets their child. She's constantly working to make sure that each child's needs are met, and that she's there for the parent and the student. That this is a relationship that will last for 4 years, and hopefully she'll get to walk that student across the stage. So that's the part of working with parents. I think for her, because of the population she works with, I'm making an assumption. She didn't actually say this directly, but in being in education for as long as I have, a lot of parents who have kids with exceptional needs, like the ones that Lauren's worked with, by the time they're high school students, the parents get the process, and they're willing to, and especially Lauren and her cohorts in that room are awesome at their job, and so they trust the teacher. Kevin's big deal is balancing the extremes, and I totally get this. Being in IEP meetings where the parents are very scary, for lack of a better way of putting it. So how do you balance the parents who are really supportive and appreciative and want to work with the teachers and want to work with the admin, and all in the name of helping their student, versus the parents who are, I know everything and you will do this, this, and this. And so that's part of where his what he needs to balance. And he's been a veteran teacher and he's been an administrator for many, many years, and I think he does a phenomenal job working with parents. He also has this really chill demeanor to him, which I think helps with parents, that he doesn't get too worked up, and he'll allow parents to either be that expert if they need to be, or be the supportive person. Working with regular ed students, Ken's big deal was trying to read the teacher, figure out what his role in every classroom is supposed to be. Some of the teachers just want him to be in the background, and some of the teachers want him walking around the room in a supervisory fashion. I have Ken in a classroom where he has to work directly with Liam, and so he sits right next to Liam, and he reads the notes off the board, or he reads the assignment to Liam. But I will call on Ken because he can contribute to knowledge, and he'll also help other students in the classroom. He's great. Lauren is just making sure that all the students' needs are met, advocating for that student, also making sure that the students is being placed in a classroom where they're being included, and not just like, here's a bunch of regular ed kids or general ed population, and here's your one off sped student. And so, and then making sure that the student is getting a little bit of the curriculum as much as they can, and not taking you, how to phrase that? How did she phrase it? Just, she didn't want to take away from the curriculum in the classroom with SPED student, but at the same time, the student is in that classroom, so let's give them that knowledge. And then the big deal for Kevin as an administrator is making sure that we as general ed or regular ed teachers knew that we had a responsibility to attend IEP meetings if we were assigned to that, and to be knowledgeable about our students. Do we walk into an IEP meeting and not know what the modifications are, and not know what the accommodations are, and not even know that this student might have an IEP until we got invited? And so, and then that last bullet I said is having expectations, but realistic ones. Making sure that regular ed teachers know that our students can achieve, and that they aren't incapable of learning. And then advice for first year administrators. Ken's was kind of just the same. Get to know your staff and understand. He said, I don't necessarily do this job to get accolades. I don't need to be thanked on a regular basis, but someone knowing my name is kind of nice, and knowing what I do, which I thought was impactful, because I think even teachers sometimes feel that way. Not necessarily that the admin doesn't know their job or doesn't know their name, but like that appreciative factor. And I can only imagine how our paraprofessionals feel, because sometimes our students are like, oh, they're just a para. And I know that in my classrooms, if I didn't have some of my paras, it wouldn't function well. So just being appreciative of who's on your staff, from the paraprofessional to the regular ed teacher to the custodian to the office help, etc. Office help, secretarial work, administrative assistants. Advice that Lauren would give is be supportive of all students. Trust the teachers know what they're doing, but also be a sounding board if necessary, and also get to know students. That relationship piece kept popping up in every single conversation I had. Which leads to Kevin's, is just establish relationships. He just mentioned that not just for our LIFT kids, our kids with exceptional disabilities, but for all kids having a learning disability, dyslexia, or aphasia, or math is hard, or an emotional or behavior disorder. School is hard enough in general for our regular ed population, and then you compound it with these disabilities. And so if an administrator can establish a relationship with these students, it would probably go a long way. And also establish relationships with your SPED teachers, and knowing how you can be supportive there. Role of SPED teachers, I feel like I'm being redundant, but making sure across the board, making sure that the needs of the student is being met, be an advocate for the student, being a go-between. Lauren just talked about being a go-between the parent and the teacher. She is probably one of our best cheerleaders for students. She's just got this great attitude. She's a class sponsor, and she has done a really good job of getting her classroom involved in student government stuff and decorating and being involved in the assemblies. And then Kevin just talked about being proactive in working with students. Don't be reactive. This might be on the next slide. But we went one-to-one, so we gave all of our students MacBooks. And so it's the big push is how can we make technology a focus in our classroom, but what about those students where that's not something they can do, or it's more of a distraction or something to that effect. So making sure that our SPED students and our SPED teachers don't feel like outcasts. And then finally, characteristics they seek in aspiring administration. Ken's was just be knowledgeable, establish relationships with not just the students, but with the paras and teachers. Lauren is very adamant, and I am too, is just making sure that our that administrators realize that just because a student has an IEP or a 504, that doesn't mean that they can't do amazing things. And also make sure that your building is as inclusive as possible. I remember going to school where we had a separate wing for students with special needs. And now we're changing our buildings to be more inclusive. And so she just said to establish a culture where that is the norm. And then Kevin just talked about willing to ask questions. You don't need to be an expert. You need to be knowledgeable enough to be dangerous, but you don't have to be an expert in all areas.